Lakeview, Uptown, Edgewater, Rogers Park. Um, and the types of issues they work on is affordable housing, living wage, things of that nature to help the community. They were big in passing the city's ARO ordinance and SRO ordinances. And for the SRO ordinances, those are the single occupancy hotel styled buildings, single resident occupancy, that you see a lot of in the uptown neighborhood that provide affordable housing to members of the community. And the ordinance created a process by which somebody would have to go by to convert those buildings into another type of building. So it's a nonprofit organization that works on all these different types of issues in those neighborhoods. And I became involved because I was looking to get involved in helping make my community a better place. And the specific campaign I've been working on is a campaign centered around community benefits agreements.
Hmm. So, could you explain what a community benefits agreement is and its relation to development and the community?
Sure. So, what a community benefits agreement is it's a contract with a developer, and that contract can be, between community organizations and the developer, between the city and the developer, or a combination of both. But it's a legally binding contract whereby the developer promises or commits to doing certain things. And in the city of Chicago, we have a land use process, right? We have if you need a zoning change, you have to go to the zoning board, and there's a planning commission. And while the aldermen don't have approval, their support of a development is a big part of the process. But what's become clear to us is that the current development process is not addressing what the community actually wants. And a community benefits agreement is one tool to make sure that the land use process does address the concerns a community wants. And that's why we're advocating for implementation of this tool.
So, community is on one side of the agreement, and the other side, is it just the developer who is the other party, or who else is on with the developer at that end of the community benefits agreement?
So it would just be the developer that is the one making the commitments in terms of what will be done with the development. But outside of the community groups, you may also have the city being a signatory to the contract. But yeah, on the developer side, it would just be the developer.
For instance, in Rogers Park, there is a new Target that's being developed at Sheridan Broadway and Devon. Target is building, and they hire developers. So is Target also at with the developer for the CPA? I know that they haven't agreed to a CPA yet, but if they did, is it just the developer who is agreeing to anything that you negotiate, or is Target also a party?
Well, the way we would think about, or maybe I should say the way I would think about Target in the context of a CBA, is Target is a tenant of the developer. So that space that Target is renting from the developer, in the future could be rented by some other company. And so what we would do is the contract would be with the developer, but we would mandate certain things from the developer in terms of what their business tenants would have to do. So for instance, one of the things you may see in a CBA is a mandate that any business tenants the developer has in the building would pay a living wage. Mm-hmm. And that then would make Target subject to having to pay that living wage. And if another company came in and took Target's place, that requirement would still be there. but you would impose that requirement on the developer and then expect them to flow it down to their business tenants.
So, have there been any successful CPAs in the city, in Chicago?
There to date have been no successful CBAs in the city that I am aware of, but there are several groups around the city who are fighting to make this a reality. One that's been in the news a lot right now is the Obama Library. And there's been a group fighting for a community benefits agreement there for some time. They haven't yet been successful, but that is a fight they are continuing to have with the city. In the one Northside area, I was working on a community benefits agreement to a building that's going up at 6145 North Broadway by Broadville and Granville. And in that one, we actually had meetings with the aldermen. We went to the community meetings. We did canvassing. We met with the developer, and we had the parameters of a contract agreed to. And in fact, we wrote up the contract, and the developer at that point just walked away, And it wasn't that the developer indicated that they had any issues with the agreement. They just said, you know what, I'm not going to agree to any of this contractually. I'm done. And, that left a pretty sour taste in my mouth because that was a development we had been working on for some time. And so once that happened, then what there was nothing there compelling the developer to be forced to enter into this agreement with us. So what we're pursuing now is an ordinance that will hopefully put some teeth behind that requirement for the developer to engage in the community, in terms of setting up a community benefits agreement and not just being able to walk away whenever they feel like it just because.
So how much time did you spend on that and wasted?
Well, I don't want to say wasted. Because I learned a lot, and
Yes.
we did. I learned a lot about what a community benefits agreement process would look like, and it took us about a year from when we started working on it to when the deal fell apart. And that's when we realized is it takes this much time, so it's from a resource perspective, it's kind of impossible for communities to always be chasing after developments as they learn about them. We really need an ordinance to create a infrastructure where we're able to get out in front of these developments.
So when you want to get a city community benefits agreement ordinance, what are the steps that just approximately what steps would you have to accomplish in order for such an ordinance to come to pass?
Sure, I think there's many steps that we'll have to accomplish, and we've started working on some of those. Like I said, there are groups fighting for these community benefits agreements.
Such as what are some of the groups?
COCO is working for the one on the Obama Library. There's the.
Could you let the listeners know what COCO stands for?
I wish I could. I forget what.
Oh, that's okay.
What the exact acronym stands for. My apologies. That's why
okay.
I went with the acronym. The Alliance for the Southeast is working on one, or will be soon, for a development that's happening on the southeast side. There were the Logan Square Neighborhoods Association. Why they didn't have a specific community benefits agreement, their alderman did introduce an ordinance that had aspects of a community benefits agreement at City Council last year. So those are some of the groups working on it. There's others as well, and what we've done is we've met with these groups so that we have an understanding of what the issues are that people around the city are fighting for in these agreements, to make sure that our ordinance captures them. And also, the if there was a citywide ordinance, it has to have, things that everybody agrees to. Because each development is unique and each development poses its own unique opportunities in terms of what kind of benefits a community may want out of those. But what we've learned in our conversations is there are some baseline things that everybody seems to be fighting for. And so I think our ordinance would mandate some baseline requirements and then mandate a process by which the community would be engaged. But we're at the beginning steps of this in terms of getting aldermanic support behind this concept. That I would say is our next step. And One Northside has a convention in May, I believe May 6th, where there will be several aldermen, and we will be pushing them to commit to the tenets of a community benefits agreement campaign. So that's what I would view as kind of the two big important steps of this that we're working on right now: getting feedback from all the groups around the city working on these issues, and then getting support from aldermen.
Okay, so it's mainly two parts, the most important two parts right now. What are the baseline requirements? Could you describe several of them so that our listeners at WZRD Chicago will have a better understanding of what a CPA involves?
Sure. So one of the things we think about is jobs. So one of the things we want to mandate is that, if a development fits the criteria by which this ordinance would be applicable, then they have to pay a living wage. And there's a Cook County living wage ordinance, and it's 14 something right now, I believe, if you don't get benefits, and 11 something an hour if you do get benefits, and we would mandate that any jobs at the development pay at least a living wage. For jobs that are subject to the prevailing wage laws, we would mandate that all of those jobs pay the prevailing wage.
I don't really understand. So they could get if it's not mandated in the CPA, you mean the developers could get away with not adhering to the city ordinance for a living wage?
Well, so for the living wage, there is no law that says a business has to pay a living wage, right?
So there's no enforcement.
Right. There's a minimum wage, right? But the living wage doesn't work like the minimum wage, where everybody is required to pay it. It's just the number that the county says, is what you need to have a living wage.
I see.
And so, the developers, if they wanted to, in their construction jobs or whatever have, of course there's unions involved here, and if there's a union contract, that's a different story. But outside of that, the developer could pay whatever the market dictates, minimum wage or above. So for instance, by mandating that they have to pay a living wage, if they have the target that you mentioned earlier, the target would have to pay a living wage to all of its employees. There's another thing. So the ARO ordinance right now, which is the city's current affordable housing ordinance, allows developers to pay into a fund instead of building affordable units within the development they're building. And the problem with that is okay, great, this money goes into a fund, but then who is using that money to build affordable housing units? And what we've seen is nobody. So if you let the developers buy out instead of building affordable housing in their actual developments, then there's nobody else making up that difference. So one of the things we would want to do is get rid of the ability of developers to buy out of having on-site affordability, and instead having to do on-site affordable housing. Another thing is the requirements right now for on-site affordability are pretty low. It's only 10%, and then if you get TIF funding, it's 20%.
Where is that mandated from? Is that federal?
That's a city. That's a city requirement. And Rahm Emanuel actually this year instituted an ARO pilot program in 3 neighborhoods in the city, where that baseline requirement has been increased to 20% across the board. And what we would want to do in ours is actually mandate that on-site affordability be increased to 30% across the board. And then the question becomes what is affordable. So the metrics the city uses is called AMI. That's area median income. And so the current standard for affordability is 60% median, 60% AMI. And what we've learned in looking at the numbers is that is not sufficient. 60% AMI still leaves a large segment of the population who need affordable housing unable to afford these affordable housing units. So we would want the ordinance to push the definition of affordability down from 60%.
To what?
Well, to 30%, I would say. This is what we're thinking. And what remains to be seen is we say 30%, but there could definitely be conversations around, if the on-site affordability requirement is increased to 30% from the current 10 to 20%, right? And half of those units are 30% AMI, and half of those units are 60% AMI. I do think there's some flexibility there, so that the numbers work. And maybe the final thing I would mention in terms of the baseline requirements is obligations for local hiring. That's something that benefits any community, right? When a new businesses come into the area, those businesses hiring from the community they exist in creates a nice environment, and one that would seem to be beneficial for everybody. So a part of our ordinance, we would want to mandate that the developer do certain things in order to fill the available jobs with members of the local community. And within that conversation, I think there would also be an appetite to incentivize developers to hire folks from groups who historically struggle to find employment, the unemployed, the underemployed, people who've previously been incarcerated, minorities, women, all the groups who historically have found handicapped individuals. I think there would be an appetite within the ordinance to incentivize developers to hire these kind of folks.
For construction jobs, you mean?
Well, for construction jobs, but also permanent jobs the development creates, right? If you have a development, you're likely going to have on-site maintenance people. You're likely going to have a property manager. If you have businesses in the development, all those businesses are going to hire people. So we really think about this as applying to any permanent jobs the development creates.
So tell me a little bit about other cities who, are there any cities in the U.S. who have successfully passed their city community benefits agreement ordinance?
There are, and maybe I'll talk about the one in Detroit because that's the one I'm most personally familiar with, and it's rather recent. And what Detroit's ordinance does is it mandates that once there is a development, that a community meeting is held, and the developer talks about the development, and then the community proposes members to serve on a neighborhood council. At the next community meeting, the pool of candidates for the neighborhood council are picked from, and the city gets to pick 6 individuals, and the community gets to vote on 2 more. And it is this neighborhood council that then interacts with the developer. And the process, and then they interact with the developer, and it's on the neighborhood council to do their own research and come to the developer with their own requests, which is problem number 1, because to tell a bunch of folks in the community, hey, you have to go do an economic impact analysis, that's not like a realistic thing your average person is going to be able to do. But anyway, this community group meets with the developer over this whole process takes about 4 to 6 weeks, but in the end, the developer doesn't have to do anything. They can, everything that they've talked about with the community or what have you, they can just say thanks but no thanks and do what they were going to do anyway. So there was a report that came out recently about the impact of the Detroit Ordinance. And some of the things that stuck out to me were that, this 4 to 6 week time frame in order for the community to engage with the developer, which goes all the way from, learning about the development to nominating candidates for the neighborhood council to voting on those candidates. That takes place over 4 to 6 weeks. And what the people who are on these neighborhood councils said is that was not nearly enough time and was a huge drain on their own personal time to get this done that quickly. But then, right, if you, as a community member, devote all this time, and then, like me, in the end, the developer doesn't have to do anything, right, then that's a pretty frustrating system and one that you could see will pretty quickly disincentivize people to be engaged. So they did pass one. There's some others. There's one in Milwaukee, I believe. There's, I think, one in Seattle, if I'm not mistaken. But I'm not as familiar with the specifics of those as I am with the Detroit Ordinance.
So was the Detroit Ordinance, did it have more teeth in the beginning, and then it had to be watered down in this way in order for it to pass?
So yeah, there was a proposal made by community groups that was had much more teeth, yes, and it was watered down a lot by the time it passed, based on the preliminary feedback, it does seem like it was watered down too much to be effective, and so I know in reading the report on it, some of the aldermen in Detroit who had supported the original ordinance, one of the things they're going to want to amend is that 4 to 6 week time frame in terms of the process, because that definitely wasn't long enough. But I still think as long as the developer is able to say no to everything, then there's a problem. And so our ordinance would not want to allow that sort of thing to happen.
It is 12 noon at WZRD Chicago, 88.3 FM, and we have in the studio with us Istvan Fekete of One Northside, discussing community benefits agreements and specifically One Northside's push for a citywide ordinance that helps mandate community benefits agreements. We will continue our discussion, and I wanted to ask you too, Istvan, is there any way that an ordinance can pass that will have that enforcement, that will have teeth enough for a developer not to be able to walk away after an agreement?
I mean, I think that's our goal, and that's what we're going to be fighting for. And I think for this to be successful, that has to be the case.
Are there many community members impacted? If there are sufficient numbers of community members impacted, and they make their views and votes known to their aldermen, would that help?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, this is something that makes sense for everybody, right? When development comes into the neighborhood, having local control over that process and making sure that development is addressing what the community wants, there is no reason in my mind for anybody to be against that. So yeah, I think the community definitely is impacted by the developments going into their neighborhoods. For all the people, whose rents are going up, you probably most directly can see the results of these. For people who lose their jobs because their business gets closed down because a development comes into the neighborhood, you are obviously seeing the effects of development very, very directly. And I think, all of us every day could see development in our neighborhoods and have thoughts about, more that development could be doing for the neighborhood.
So it seems as if development leads to gentrification, and gentrification affects negatively affects a lot of middle class wage earners. And would you say that are you trying to say that the people that will most benefit from a citywide community benefits agreement ordinance would be those that will be impacted by negatively impacted by gentrification?
Well, I wouldn't want to limit ourselves in that way, because you know paying people in your neighborhood a living wage is good for everybody. It's good for homeowners. It's good for people who rent. That is a good thing for everybody. In Uptown, we have a large homeless population. Offering affordable housing to people, we had the whole tent community, people living under bridges because there was not enough affordable housing. So, who would be against people having affordable housing versus having to live under a bridge, right? That is, again, good for everybody. So, while gentrification, is something that negatively impacts working class folks, as you mentioned, I think the nice thing about a community benefits agreement and a community benefits agreement ordinance is it can be structured in a way so that everybody benefits from it.
So, in order for it to pass and to have teeth in it, what is it about a community benefits agreement that would actually benefit a developer and, let's say, also the alderman, so that maybe we have some common ground, and then the ordinance could come to pass?
Well, so I would argue that the benefit to the aldermen is it gives them a better mechanism to represent the interests of their community, which is really their entire job, right? I mean, that's why we elect aldermen, so they're at the table representing our interests. And all this would do for them was create a better way for them to represent their community interests, because right now, when it comes to development within the communities, there is no rules of the road for these aldermen in terms of how to engage with their communities and what kind of feedback they have. They all do this in an ad hoc fashion. They have these different committees, and some work this way, some work that way, and so on and so forth. So I think it would be a benefit to the alderman that way, and for the developer, I think having community support for your development is going to be helpful for you. And as long as your project remains economically viable, why would you be against making it doing it in a way that is beneficial to the community it's going to exist in, right? If you're a business located in one of these developments, you're going to want to have a good relationship with your community, not an adversarial one. So I really think this can be done in a way where any negative impact is greatly minimized, and the positives will far outweigh the negatives.
Okay, one more important question. So, among all the community organizations that you've worked with, has there ever been an organization that happened to work with a developer that something came out of that those negotiations that was good? Was there a developer that was willing to happily work with a community organization, or has it always been adversarial?
Well, so in my experience, the community benefits agreement I worked on, the developer was not adversarial at all. And, honestly, I think it was a bit of a bait and switch tactic, because in the end, he told us to take a hike and walked away without committing to anything. But there were no objections raised to any of the things we discussed with him, and we had several, face-to-face meetings, and it was all, so the baseline requirements that I talked about here. There are community groups who have been able to get concessions from developers, but those have been through the alderman
Mm-hmm.
versus any type of contract directly with the community, or it's been through a contract the developer has with the city of Chicago directly. And one of the things that we've seen with the SRO ordinance is that, just because an ordinance is on the books, if it's solely up to the city to monitor and enforce it, things can fall through the cracks. So in our minds, it's very important that the community itself is part of monitoring and enforcing the commitments these developers make. So that's what we're looking for is those benefits that people have maybe been able to win in kind of these one-off unique situation. There's more of a standardized process by which we're getting those benefits on a consistent basis.
Would you have enforcement details in an agreement? And if so, what kind of enforcement details would you be suggesting?
So, I think enforcement is something that, in my mind, in terms of once an ordinance is put into place that we don't have quite pinned down yet,
Mm-hmm.
because enforcement can take a bunch of different forms, right? And the city could enforce breaches of one, I think there needs to be a reporting structure by where the developer is reporting to the city and the community the steps they've taken towards meeting their obligations.
Mm-hmm.
And there's actually a system out there that exists whereby when a developer hires somebody, for instance, to meet like a local hiring requirement, that they just input that hire into that system and the data is updated in real time. So I think reporting creates that accountability, but then for actually enforcement, there's options out there. For instance, the city could suspend their license applications until they rectify the situation or fine them. So there's enforcement like that from the city, but also if you had private nonprofits, right? I shouldn't say private, but nonprofits that were parties to these contracts, and the nonprofits could pursue enforcement, on their own.
Like NGOs.
Right.
But local. Okay, that's so interesting. Well, thank you so much, Istvan. We have been speaking with Istvan Fekete from One Northside about the One Northside's push for a city ordinance that mandates community benefits agreements. Is that a good way of putting it, Istvan?
Yes, I think so, and thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.